Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Dinah Birch, Pro Vice-Chancellor for Cultural Engagement here at the University of Liverpool, and I'm honoured to be here today to welcome you all to the Liverpool Literary Festival. So, following the great success of our previous festivals, we're really pleased to welcome more internationally renowned writers to the city, and some who will be internationally renowned. Just give them time. The festival's main sponsors are Student Roost and Bruntwood, and we're very grateful for their support. We will leave time after our talk for audience questions, but please wait for microphones so that everyone can hear you. This afternoon, I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to celebrate the winners of our short story competition. The competition was open to all members of the university, and there were 3 categories: staff, postgraduate, and undergraduates. We judged the entries of an experienced panel, including, I may say, a student, and they were thoughtful, provocative, and original. It was very hard to choose winners. There was a broad theme: looking forward, looking backward, and that theme was interpreted in a variety of really creative and innovative ways. We did choose, as you see, and I'm very happy to say that all 3 winners are with us today. So, before I congratulate all 3, I'm going to invite Patrick Gale to say a few words. Patrick, over to you.
Thank you, Dinah, and a huge thank you to the University of Liverpool for organising this competition. Short stories are precious. Many people in this country seem to be under the false impression that you write a short story as preparation for becoming a novelist. Actually, I think short stories are far harder to pull off than a novel, because in a little space you have to deliver something that's emotionally satisfying and doesn't leave the reader feeling shortchanged. But these competitions also matter enormously because they often will give a writer a precious leg up. And I say this with great feeling because my own career began entirely thanks to a short story competition, which long ago landed me my first publishing contract. So I really hope that Phil and Marta and Trudy Ann don't stop with their wonderful winning stories, but will go on possibly just writing short stories, because you can be proud as a story writer, but maybe spreading your wings and writing the far easier thing, which is a novel. Anyway, I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. So, now it's for me to congratulate each of our winners. And I'm going to start with the winner of the staff category, Phil Olsen, with his brilliant story, Do Not Point at the Sun. Phil. And now, the winner of our postgraduate category, Marta Zanuku, another brilliant story, Close Reading. And finally, the winner of our undergraduate category, Trudy Ann Smith, with a fantastic story, God Stood Me Up, and I don't know why. Oh, you must 3 very worthy winners, and you all have a hard copy of the anthology that we publish every year, short stories, 4 stories by celebrated, published authors, but also the winning entries of these competitions. And you will find it fascinating to read all 7 stories together and to see how the stories link across that broad theme, looking forward, looking backward. So now I'm going to introduce Saul Leslie. There's Saul, smiling and looking benevolent. He's a PhD student here at the University of Liverpool, and he's working on presentations of disability in literature. He is one of last year's winners of the short story competition, and Saul is going to lead a conversation between the 3 winners before we finally leave time for some questions from you, the audience. So, over to you, Saul.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Am I audible? Yeah? Thank you very much, Diana, for your generous introduction, and thanks also to Patrick for your kind words. For those of you who've not yet read Patrick's latest book, Mother's Boy, I would highly recommend it, not just because of the parts of it that are set in Liverpool. It's really wonderful. Before we get into the crux of the discussion with our 3 very deserving winners, I just want to add to what Dinah said about the reason why I'm sitting in this chair. And as she said, yes, I was the fortunate winner of last year's postgraduate competition for The Great Read. And this year I'm very generous that I've been promoted to the position of chair. The theme of last year was changing natures, and my story, Loggerhead. Some of the themes I think dovetailed a little bit with the themes that Patrick explores in his book of parents and children, particularly mothers and sons. And in Loggerhead, an estranged mother and her nearly adolescent son find themselves on a Mediterranean beach in the warm evening climate that I'm sure some of us would be willing to go to right now. And they're fortunate enough to witness the birthing or the hatching of a clutch of loggerhead turtles. And I will just read a very short passage before we get onto these 3 superior stories. On this margin, he organizes the components of something he's never thought before. Right now, somewhere else, this is taking place. Not the quarrel on the dunes, but this moment by the water. Turtles have hatched, perhaps all over the planet, and maybe someone else is now standing in the shallows looking to a dark horizon, beyond which is him. This is his and this is theirs, shared and separate. As the surf gently folds on itself, tectonic plates shift inside him, accommodating this contradiction. What he'll lose to make space he doesn't yet know. He crouches, cool, wet sand widening the gaps between his toes, a dome of stars above like a collection of broken cameras in the clutch of a mother's hands. When she's finished up on the dunes, he'll try telling her about this, if it translates. Until then, he'll stay here, imagining all those little bodies swimming out on a moontide of white petals, diving deep down, while he's the only creature breathing. So that's why I'm here, justifiably or not, to add something like literary continuity between last year's winners and this year's. And now, having very briefly looked back on last year, I would like to turn to looking forward to this year and begin with with one of our 3 winners, Phil. As Dinah said, the winner of the staff category. And your story entitled "Do Not Point at the Sun," really, really wonderful evocation of Liverpool, of a local space, where the theme of looking is very central. And it's not just metaphorical, it's very literal. Lots of moments where to be seen or to see is really, really pivotal. And I use the word pivotal somewhat in a loaded sense because, of course, the narrator describes walking along the pier just on the opposite side of the River Mersey and encounters, because of the advice of a mysterious busker figure, a telescope which, if you look through it, reveals some hidden truths about the city. But of course this telescope is not pivotal, it's rigid, it's stuck. I was wondering if you could begin by just describing a little bit about how you came up with this interpretation of the theme of looking forward, looking back.
Yeah, sure.
Cheers.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of I like wordplay, I suppose, and I like prompts. So when the competition was announced and the kind of theme of looking forward, looking back, I mean, obviously it evokes a bit of a kind of a reflection of kind of time. But I thought, well, what if I took it literally? Can I think of something that, you know, sort of should be looking forward but is looking back? So that kind of, you know, is where the original idea came from in terms of the telescope. And then obviously during kind of the lockdown period, I was spending a lot more time kind of trapped in in New Brighton, the seaside town just across the way from the Mersey, because obviously it's only 20 minutes on the Merseyrail into Liverpool, but during that period the River Mersey might as well have been the Atlantic Ocean. It was kind of, you know, sort of being kind of completely cut off and stranded. So I suppose I was perhaps paying more attention to the sort of details in front of me. Mm-hmm.
See, it's interesting the way that you describe the Mersey as some kind of enormous barrier, which we now regard. I mean, if none of you have gone over to the Wirral, I'd highly recommend it because it's very, very easy, unless, of course, there's a pandemic on, which creates something of a blockage. But I was really struck with how vividly you evoke Liverpool and the Wirral and New Brighton, but you give very specific places. The lighthouse, Perch Rock, I think it's called, Perch Rock, and you describe the Wirral, and the river is ever present. Though a blockage, it is ever present and flowing. And what is it, do you think, about Liverpool and the river that is generative in this way?
I mean, yeah, I don't know. Sorry, it's a slightly sort of trickier one to.
Like, how does the river, the presence of the river, this being River City, how does it help to generate a creative process?
Well, I mean, sort of on a pretty basic level, I suppose. I do a lot of dog walking along the prom. So,
hence the T-shirt.
Yeah, so I have a rescue retired greyhound, so he's here in spirit today. But yeah, so kind of, you know, a lot of that observation of the river, of the other side of the river, has been from just kind of walking around, and obviously dogs like routines. They like kind of to stick to a certain route, and I sometimes think if I was doing that same walk or those same walks without the dog, I would look like a pretty strange person kind of thing. But obviously, you know, kind of the dog helps kind of, and you know, Boo, my greyhound, is constantly kind of sniffing and looking at every little kind of detail as we walk around. So I suppose then I'm also looking around and sort of observing those things more.
There's a tip for you. You want to write, get a dog. So although you it's locally set, you avoid, I think, really, really impressively, the trappings of cliche around Liverpool. In the story, the narrator doesn't describe the Liver building, doesn't describe, I'm not going to sing it, but the ferry across the Mersey. Instead, you provide a much a much more, I suppose, authentic series of architectural locales. So there's the brutalist ventilation shafts on either side of the river. There's the red cranes towards Crosby. Was that a conscious choice to avoid those things that are typically associated with Liverpool?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think obviously, all of those things are kind of vivid images, but they're sort of kind of catered for in lots of other, kind of ways, lots of other places kind of thing. So I think it was not trying to focus in on the rundown aspects, but just that kind of hyper-local, what is right in front of you kind of thing. I mean, those red shipping cranes, even though they're in Liverpool, they're so big, they look like they're in New Brighton. So they kind of, they look like they're sort of right there with you. So they're sort of quite dominating. But yeah, obviously, like architecturally, there's so much fascinating stuff. Some of it considered beautiful, some of it considered less so kind of thing.
What do you think of the brutalist ventilation shafts? They're a controversial aesthetic feature.
I really like them. I mean, I kind of like concrete architecture, fan of Preston Bus Station, etc. But no, I mean, I think my favourite thing about the ventilation shafts is that each set of ventilation shafts is from a particular era. So obviously you've got the beautiful Art Deco 1930s shafts from the first tunnel, the Queensway tunnel, and then you've got the 1970s kind of loudspeaker type ones from the Kingsway tunnel, and I guess it just kind of harks back to a particular time. And even though they're both just tunnels that go under the Mersey, they've both got their kind of differences because they came along at a different point in time.
And those things, when you're walking, do you find there's a continuity between those architectural spaces that walking allows you to access? Like, let's say you get the ferry across the Mersey from Liverpool to New Brighton, and then you're walking along and you're sort of tracing the history of the development of those architectural spaces as you are walking. So this is sort of, you're temporally moving through architecture.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could put it better than that in a way. Yeah, no, I mean, kind of walking through time in some respects, and it's kind of popping up as you go along. Some places kind of are built all at once. So, for example, like Miami is very Art Deco because the whole place went up in the 30s kind of thing. Yeah. Or post-war, somewhere like Coventry becomes very, 1950s, 1960s. Sure. And then a lot of other places, they evolve over time, and you get a sort of real mixture of.
And I mean, yeah, you've mentioned the Art Deco, and I think that's one of the things in your story that is so well described is these arcades on New Brighton, Art Deco arcades, and there's a sense in which these are sort of, there's a slightly faded grandeur to them, which contrasts or is juxtaposed perhaps with the, I want to say, Caterpillar roller coaster. Could you describe a little bit about the interplay between those two different kinds of epoch or decade?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, if no one's seen them, they're a beautiful shape, the arcades, but they're not in great shape. Sort of it is all a bit crumbling. But then the kind of the fairground is all sort of to the side of it and round the back of it. And I actually watched that Caterpillar ride being dismantled and put on the back of a truck and, being driven away. So that was kind of, inspired by that just real experience of wondering where it was off to. Was it off to the tip, or was it off to another fairground?
Be reassembled.
Yeah,
and, given wings and. Would you mind reading a short passage?
Sure. Yeah.
Yes, page 10, please, if you wouldn't mind.
So yeah, this is about halfway down page 10. So I figure I might not have much time to find out one way or the other. At first, I consider climbing over the marine light railings early morning before the day tripper crowd arrives. But then I remember that I need to wait for Daisy's Donuts to open. which is probably not until 10 or 11 a.m. So I opt for a weekday to try and limit my audience. Maybe I could make it look like I'm trying to repair the telescope, but then people would think I'd done a terrible job when I leave the viewfinder still stuck, pointing in the wrong direction. Maybe I could make light of hanging precariously and joke with passers-by that I'm keen to see the urban views, tell them I'm pigeon spotting. That's not really me, though. I wouldn't be convincing. I could have gone and spoken to Daisy, ordered a donut, and inquired politely about the rumoured ankle tattoo. Or said I was thinking of getting a tattoo myself, thinking maybe on my ankle, see what she'd say to that. She'd either know that I was after a clue, or, if the rumour had been invented by the busker, she might just say, "Oh, hey, I've got one there. Join the club." I could have ordered a donut and peered over the counter. I could have asked if she'd seen the busker lately, feigned concern. That way, I might find out if she has or had any connections to him whatsoever. But it's easy to think of those other possibilities once a particular avenue has been embarked upon. And I'm here now, clinging onto the twisted round telescope above the marine lake. A polystyrene tray floats in the lake, its top pecked into a pattern of chevrons. If the busker was here, he'd probably tell me they were a clue. More arrows.
Thank you so much. Clinging onto a twisted round telescope is a precarious image that Phil decides to leave the reader and the main protagonist dangling from. And it seems that this is a very common thread I've noticed in all three of your stories, and I'll move on now to Marta Zanuko and your wonderful story, Close Reading, where we see a very different kind of attitude towards bodies in spaces, whereas Phil's is wide open and broad. The space in which you choose to situate your characters is much more confined, much more restricted. I want to say domestic. Perhaps this is a university accommodation, it seems, at least a campus domicile. Is that about right?
Yes.
And so with that, there are all these dynamics that emerge as strangers. I'm sure some of you, if you're in accommodation at the moment, you'll know that there are all sorts of new dynamics that emerge as strangers are thrown together. Was that part of what precipitated this story?
Yeah, I would say so. The story is loosely based on personal experience and on a real friendship. I went to university in my hometown. I'm from Venice, and that's where I studied before I started my PhD here. So I didn't live in a student accommodation, but I was shortly living in a student hall when I did my Erasmus in the UK. And that's the space I was thinking about when I was portraying this friendship that is born in that kind of space, yes.
And this friendship it's so sensitively depicted. The narrator it describes very, very deep emotions between the narrator and the person to whom this story is addressed. Not necessarily romantic, but certainly heartfelt and potentially consummated. It's left ambiguous. Is there a sense in which these sorts of spaces, university spaces, contribute to very peculiar kinds of emotional relationships between people who are otherwise strangers, would otherwise never have met?
Yeah, I would say there is an element of that. I found that thinking about this small space helped me, especially because the story had to be very short, and I wanted to cover a lot in terms of emotional material, and what the story is trying to do really is to give an overview of this friendship that lasts approximately 3 years, the 3 years of a bachelor degree, by focusing on specific moments in this friendship. and I wanted to keep it contained, so that's why I used the student hall as a setting for it.
It's really, really well put together in that sense. And, you know, Patrick was alluding to earlier about the short story art form. And yes, it can be confining, but as Marta has proved, it can also produce really effective results with having this kind of limitation to it. And specifically about the bodies that you depict, I noticed that there's not much in the way of describing whole bodies. They are separated into constituent parts. There's a close-up description of arms or eyes or knees or throat, as if there's a separation of bodies into limbs rather than whole bodies. Is this also about a kind of disassociation that people have in these new strange environments?
I guess that was more about trying to portray the experience of the person the story is addressed to, who has this episode. That there is this episode that's central to the story, and even if it's not mentioned explicitly, it's supposed to be about a panic attack, and the way she describes it to the narrator is as if she's split in half and she can't feel the left half of her body. So yeah, I guess that sense of bodies as separated into parts, as you were observing, should resonate with that, should be about that experience.
I mean, that scene that you just described in the restaurant, the Greek Taverna, is phenomenal.
Thank you.
Really beautifully written. And so, I suppose, having just mentioned writing in that sense, I wonder if there is a solution to this disassociation and this confining. And you write, and very beautifully elsewhere, using a Collins dictionary. The Collins dictionary becomes an artifact which is used to, I suppose, metaphorically open up the potential for connection. If any of you are undergrads, get yourself a big, thick Collins dictionary, because it can be used to wedge open your door in your bedroom. And this is depicted really, really effectively in your story. So does that mean that storytelling and books can figuratively open doors to allow connection between people?
Yeah, I like to think that. In the story, these friendships certainly revolves around a shared interest in reading and writing. Yeah. The narrator and the person the story is addressed to are always talking about their respective seminars, the essays they're writing. So yeah, the idea that stories might connect us is certainly there. At the same time, I guess what I was trying to do with this narrator and this narrator's voice was to make her take over her friend's voice in a way that's not necessarily good, that's not necessarily something we should find reliable or even relate to. And I was really interested, more than in depicting these two friends as equal, in depicting this dynamic where the person who's writing is actually taking over the other person's story and the other person's experience, and acknowledging that as well.
There is a sense of a slightly predatory aspect to the narrator, or maybe a kind of power grab. But then it's like it's so well inverted again, because of course the other character seems to be more successful in the pursuit of writing. So it's a sort of power grab from a position of weakness.
Yeah, I had to give the other character that success because I didn't want her to be just an object of the narrator's writing of the narrator's story. I wanted her to be writing, and possibly writing about something completely different. And the narrator, of course, has no access to that, has no access to our interiority. So yeah,
Would you mind reading a bit for us?
Yeah, sure.
You mentioning the seminar made me think of that passage with reference to a certain writer who appears in this collection, James Joyce. He's going to be big.
It was in that communal kitchen that only the previous semester I had been rambling on about my seminar on Ulysses, sometimes disappearing halfway through a meal to come back with my Oxford Words Classics edition, chock full of page markers, and read aloud the bits I found funny or impenetrable, or both. You would tell me about your Victorian literature classes. You were reading Lady Audley's Secret and The War of the Words and Adam Bede, with your eyes glimmering the way your eyes did. At the beginning of our time together, I couldn't really stand it, how your gaze shone unabashedly when you were talking about a short story you just discovered, or how you wouldn't stop nodding during our tutorials. I was appalled by your unironic eagerness to learn. But then, as I got close to you, I saw there was no affectation, no posturing in that way of carrying your body through your university years. I started chasing that glimmer, hungering for the strength it gave me to catch sight of it. Time hasn't really passed since the night you asked me if you could sleep in my bed because you were afraid of dying, although you were completely fine, physically healthy, perfectly safe. And I said no. If I could reverse the years and change one thing, it would be that no. I would let your cool skin brush against mine in my single bed, and I would close read your fear, looking for patterns of meaning, connecting your breathless words to compose a coherent explanation. If I could go back and perform the smallest possible action to prevent a catastrophic event, like the protagonist of that Asimov novel I read long before I met you, I would not deny you the comfort of my touch when you most urgently needed to feel real.
Wonderful, thank you. That phrase, your unironic eagerness to learn, really, really affecting. And I think speaks to something that perhaps we're all partly familiar with, which is how to negotiate wanting to be authentic and sincere in the pursuit of doing things well, but also feeling obliged to act as if we're not trying hard. I wonder if that's something that goes beyond the campus. You know, that's something that we all face beyond university life. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Trudy, our third deserving winner for the undergrad category. Your wonderful story, wonderfully named, as Dinah pointed out, God Stood Me Up and I Don't Know Why. Again, in terms of restricting of spaces in which stories are set, even more so the Martyrs, because this story takes place, at least notionally, within the confines of the narrator's head, you know, as they're trying to negotiate a familiar world in the aftermath of terrible trauma. And you handle this so sensitively, this difficult topic and this difficult issue. And this character must negotiate familiar spaces, their church and their family home, in a body that now feels completely alien. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about was how one of the ways in which you do this so sensitively is to create a narrator who uses shapes, different shapes, rectangles, circles and things, and different basic colours to help them make sense of this trauma. Where did the shapes and the motif of shapes and colours come from?
Well, first of all, I think shapes and colours are quite basically a thing that everyone can relate to in some way, and that was one of the reasons. But also, I get quite a lot of my writing advice, rather, from YouTube. So I'm forgetting the name of the person exactly, but I was watching a YouTube video that explained how things that we all see in life can have very different meanings to different people. And I sort of took that and ran with it. And also I've studied art for a very long time, and I know that art is something that a lot of people can relate to, either indirectly or directly. So, yeah, that's where that came from.
See, another tip there for wannabe writers: don't just get the dog, but spend a lot of time on YouTube, because it produces such nourishing results. And to focus a little bit more on this this motif of therapy, the tone of the story is so interesting, because it's slightly melancholic or ironic in its tone, and the narrator points out at various times the limits of what therapy can do, and at one point describes therapy as the only extracurricular activity that they can do. How is it that therapy is something that we increasingly, I think, rely on to try and make sense of ourselves, but also it's a kind of leisure pursuit?
It's interesting to me that you took that perspective, because my intention while writing that part of the story was that therapy was more of a thing that she has to do rather than something she wants to do. So it felt like, at least to me, an extracurricular activity is something that you do outside of school. Like growing up, it's something that your parents sort of force onto you, at least in my culture. And most of the time it's something you don't want to do, but something that's actually good for you. So, yeah, that was it, really.
And that kind of explains the slightly bitter tone of the story, because
that she has towards it, yeah.
That she resents this, what she's being told to do.
Yeah.
And of course it's then paradoxical, because this relationship with the therapist is very much, it's a very sensitive, private relationship with the therapist.
Mm-hmm.
But since she's now doing this because her parents told her to do this,
yeah,
it adds a different dimension.
Yeah.
Did then you get a sense of how therapy, or rather the relationship between a therapist and a client or a patient, I'm trying to say this without revealing the reveal at the end, but that the main narrator is aware that everything that is being spoken of between therapist and patient is then sent back to the parents.
Yeah.
What effect do you think that has on the kinds of sensitive communications that are made between therapist and the narrator?
Well, it limits the communication, really, because I feel like a lot of us don't necessarily want our true thoughts to get back to our parents for very different reasons. For Amira, which is the character in this story, her reason is that she's ashamed, and so she doesn't necessarily open up in that way, because she's scared that whatever she says will get back to her parents and she'll be punished for that. And I feel like a lot of teenagers specifically struggle with that. I'm not sure if it's like across everyone, really, but a lot of the friends I have and a lot of people that I communicate with have very similar experiences in that way.
See, that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about, is your sense of the way that young people feel when confronted with these terrible situations, because there's a beautiful phrase that I might ask you to read a bit, that includes where you describe becoming a geriatric teenager. Yeah. And do you get the sense that teenagers are kind of being forced, either through parental directive or otherwise, to get old before their time, to mature in that way?
Yeah, I think it's not only parents, but just social media as well, because there's a lot on social media that sort of forces teenagers to grow up, and it's not like intentional, I don't think, in any way, but it's just like, it can be like something as simple as there's videos online that go around guessing people's age, for example, and although that's so simple, it sort of ages people and ages teenagers specifically, and forces them to like be more mature. And even in life, like being on a bus and having kids, you know, screaming at the back of the bus, they're forced to be quiet and to be, you know, more like, I don't know, mature and just, you know, fixed, I suppose. So just examples like that forces kids to sort of be older than they actually are.
And of course, the crux of the trauma in this is somebody who has has been forced out of nature and is forced into a behaviour that they didn't want. And you handle that with such sensitivity as well. It's really extraordinary. And I was wondering if you would mind reading a little bit of it. I realised I didn't cite the page number for Marta's reading, but for Trudy, would you mind reading page 49, please? Read along.
Five is orange. It highlights the undersides of the leaves, orange tulips. My therapist says I should think about getting a part-time job, join a club, meet some friends. I want to tell her I have my hands full, but that would be a lie. I wish I had my hands full. Instead, I spend my precious alone hours wishing I wasn't alone. I colour. I'm sitting on the floor in my bedroom, colouring, imagining that Kaz is probably colouring too. Probably with her boyfriend, Jacob, who is most likely watching her in awe from across the room, probably listening to him stroke his guitar, probably not thinking about me at all. I'm obsolete, a teenager who spent her hours shading in shapes, following prescribed patterns to make mass-produced art. I am a 17-year-old retiree, a geriatric. Only that can't be true because I have so much life ahead of me, according to my parents anyway. I sit here doing nothing, while my sister is in her 3rd year of university studying fine art, preparing to have her art displayed at a gallery, her life in order. She's the perfect golden child, which is why I can't for the life of me see why Mom would shut her out. We don't talk about Kaz, she would say every time I brought her up. So we don't.
Thank you so much. And again, a wonderful evocation of the sorts of things that people lean on in order to get through difficult situations, thinking about colours and focusing in on the underside of leaves of tulips. And I'd encourage you all to read through that story in order to see recurring motifs of flowers. It's really wonderful. Well, thank you to the three of you for reading and for giving me some airtime. But now I'd like to pass over to our audience. Now I know that there will be mics coming around for questions. Please do raise your hand if you have any, and someone will bring you a mic. Frank.
I wonder, would each of the prize winners mind recommending one book that we should all read?
Other than this one, of course.
Of course.
Phil? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm a big fan of George Saunders, American short story writer. He's written lots of short story collections, but maybe recommend Pastoralia as a starting point. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was also trying to think of a book of short stories, but instead I would say, even if it's really popular, you probably have already read it, Jennifer Egan's Visit from the Goon Squad, which is a novel, but it's made up of interlocked chapters that can be read as separate short stories as well.
I don't know. That's a tough question because I'm into like super weird books.
The weirder the better.
It has like quite literally nothing to do with literature actually, and some romance books as well. But I would recommend a book that I recently started reading, which is called Sugar and Spice by Doe. Yeah, it's a black love story. I enjoyed that quite well.
Great, well, get to your local libraries, people. Thanks, Frank. Anyone else? Nikki, down the front here.
Thanks so much, guys. That was wonderful. This question's for you, Trudy. Quite a few therapists kind of mention that to colour is a form of cathartic meditation and also kind of a way to focus your mind when you're dealing with trauma or anxiety and things like that. Is that something that you agree with? Is that something that inspired your story, would you say? Or?
I do agree with it, but that's not necessarily the reason I connected with it so much. I've just been studying art for a very long time, and that's always been a therapeutic way of getting out of my own head. Not specifically just colouring, but just moving, essentially, or having something to do, or like counting, for instance, to get myself out of my own head. So, yeah, I do agree.
I think that's interesting you mentioned that, Nikki, and that response, because one of the things in your story that was so interesting was the narrator notes the limits of what therapy can do, and limits also describes that there's no page in a parental handbook for helping a child recover from a trauma. And so maybe art and reading and writing can offer solutions where other kinds of pursuit are not so successful. Anyone else in the audience? Patrick at the front here on... Oh, sorry, Joanna, I didn't see. Please.
And you said, when you were describing Marta's story, you said domestic. And it's amazing to me that that it is domestic. Because Marta's story doesn't seem to me about domesticity at all. I mean, we all come from somewhere, don't we?
Yeah, I actually agree. I agree. I didn't want to disagree with your description.
Please, a bit of dissent is always good.
Yeah, especially the image with which I start the story, which is of these perfectly identical, perfectly symmetrical rooms that are adjacent. I wanted to convey this sense of almost alienation that this setting produces. And in a way that's standardized, in a way that's very different from home.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very interesting. I wondered though if for undergrads or people studying a degree, if the space in which they occupy for 3 years or halls, let's say, takes on a simulacrum of a domestic or a home setting, or whether it's always a slightly quasi kind of home where it's alienated. Yeah.
And the narrator references.
Virginia Woolf said it was a great mistake to think that only big things were important.
Yeah, and in the story, the narrator references their respective homes and how she imagines they must be different as well. And then they find themselves in these identical spaces. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Joanna, as well. Patrick, yes, you were going to...
Thank you. I'm fascinated because two out of the three of you do not work in a creative writing environment. You're doing very different things in your lives. I wondered if each of you could say something about where your writing fits in your life, how you're managing to do it.
So I basically just have to try and kind of fit it around the sides, the edges, evenings, weekends, wherever I can. I did a creative writing MA part-time a few years ago while working full-time, and had to sort of twist a few arms to kind of persuade them to let me do that kind of thing. Because, I only kind of came to it as a mature. I was nearly 40 when I sort of did that. So it is just kind of squeezing it in where I can. But obviously a lot of the material, a lot of the kind of observations and stuff just gets compiled either in my head or a notebook, and then when I get a chance to stick it on the page, I will do.
Okay. I'm an architecture student in my 3rd year, so that already doesn't give me a lot of time to write. But it's usually when like I can't sleep, or like, I don't know, I have to force myself to write sometimes, otherwise it just never gets done. Because I have so many other things outside of writing that I have going on. So yeah, it's just making it a priority really, otherwise it just never gets done. Yeah, missing sleep, not missing assignments. I'm 21.
Marta, how about you? Because I remember when I was reading English as an undergraduate, it was the least creative time of my life because I was so terrified of putting anything on paper. I was surrounded by critics and tutors. So how are you coping on a creative writing degree?
No, definitely. It's terrifying to write because I feel like I know what good writing looks like as someone who's doing a PhD in English literature, and I don't really want to compete with that. And I'm also writing in my second language, which makes it potentially even more terrifying. But yeah, I'm trying to do it anyway. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Chris at the front here.
There's a question for all three. Did you write your stories in one go and then return to them to edit them, or did you write them in bits?
No. The simple answer to that question is no. At least not for me. It took me a few months, not just writing, but to think of the story takes a lot more time than actually writing it out. And then once you start writing, it takes at least for me, it takes 2 weeks.
Yeah, same for me. I was actually writing bits of this story and, let's say, sketches from this friendship for quite a long time. And then when the short story competition came up, I decided to piece them together and decide what the specific story should be about and which should be the central element, and then just chose the bits that fit and tried to make it coherent as much as possible.
With mine, the kind of a lot of the place description and the observational details kind of were in my notes, so either on my phone or in a notepad kind of thing. So kind of pieced a lot of the geography of it together. Not in one go, but then when I actually came to write the story about the character clinging to the telescope, that kind of all came out in more or less one go, and I didn't know how it was going to end until I was in the kind of thick of writing it kind of thing. So it's sort of, yeah.
I think I'd have allowed you the preparation time. It just meant the actual story itself really. Did that all come in one lump rather than, when you said it quite rightly, you did your preparation, then you wrote your story.
Yeah, the character's situation and the story for me all sort of kind of poured out in more or less one go. Yeah.
Well, brilliant. Thank you so much, and thank you for wonderful questions. Oh, I think have we got time for one more question? Yes, I think we do. Please.
Really, how important was the competition in stimulating you to? Would you have produced the story anyway without the competition, or was the competition the stimulus you needed to put it together?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always sort of trying to write short stories, but kind of prompts and deadlines are brilliant for, kind of concentrating the mind. And this had both. This, kind of, there was a deadline and there was a theme. And even though it's quite a loose theme, it's sort of, I'm not very good with a blank page or a blank canvas. I like to work within a restrictive brief. So that kind of sparked a lot of the idea for my story.
How important was the competition?
Yeah, I was nodding emphatically because I agree with everything you just said. The deadline was definitely useful because, as I was saying, I had been writing about this for a long time, and then when I was aware of a deadline, that's when I started actually putting it together, I guess. So yeah, it's
the deadline was
it's useful, yes, in my experience at least.
You, Ali?
I feel like I would have put my story out there anyways, but I feel like the deadline pushed it forward a lot faster. Because actually publishing this short story has inspired me to make it into a novel of some sort. So yeah, I feel like the deadline definitely pushed it forward, but it would have eventually gotten into the world somehow.
Well, thank you. I hope we can all draw inspiration from that. Please, can you join me in thanking our three esteemed writers here? Diana.
And thanks to you, Saul, for chairing a great discussion. Thank you, Phil, Marta, Trudy Ann. So interesting. And thanks to the audience. Very attentive and excellent questions. So I hope that you've all enjoyed this event as much as I have. And I hope, too, that we might welcome you back onto our campus soon to attend one of the many other public events we run throughout the year. If you would like more information, then visit our web pages for listings of all future events, or indeed to sign up to our events newsletters. So meanwhile, thanks again. Have a good lunch. See you all soon.